This hearing will come to order. I'll ask the members all to take their seats, if you will. Today we hear from Deputy Secretary of State John Sullivan on the proposed reforms that he and Secretary Tillerson are working on for the State Department and for the Agency for International Development. I don't think there are many that question the need to improve the operation of both agencies. A more efficient and effective State Department and USAID would better promote our national security and our many other interests around the world. So I have welcomed the administration's undertaking. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has started a process here, as those at State will tell you, where he's focusing on listening to the diplomats and listening to the employees, our Foreign Service officers. And I think this is very commendable. He has sought feedback here from the bottom up. Many employees, he reports, have asked, and I think this speaks volumes. They've asked for more responsibility and in turn more accountability for their performance. They also want better training throughout their careers and a modern IT infrastructure. And I think they deserve these tools, and we would be all better off if they had them. So I welcome Secretary Tillerson's efforts to address the Department's aging technology infrastructure and to strengthen the diversity of the Department's workforce, including increased recruitment. He has focused specifically on veterans and minority candidates, and this is a goal the committee here has long supported. But as a country with global challenges and opportunities, I do have continued concerns about whether our diplomats and development specialists will have the resources they need. Yes, there is room for savings. We need savings, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that our diplomacy and assistance improves our national security, improves our economic well-being for a relatively small amount of money. Consider this committee's word. To sanction rogue regimes like Iran over their missile program or like North Korea, it takes skilled, properly resourced diplomacy to build international support for sanctions enforcement. And the same is true when it comes to convincing nations to turn away cheap labor from North Korea, for example. It takes our diplomats going out and explaining, when you're doing an arrangement where you're not paying those workers from North Korea, you're only feeding them, and you're sending the check, the foreign currency, to the regime, that money is going into the nuclear weapons program. That has to end because of our sanctions. That has to be explained by our Foreign Service officers. Or working with us to counter Hezbollah. Or granting our health specialists access to halt an emerging pandemic in its tracks, as was done in West Africa with the Ebola virus. Robust diplomacy is also needed in conflict zones to defeat ISIS and to defeat other threats. And that is what we hear from our generals, who understand the critical need for our country to have successful political and not just military strategies. But this leadership requires us being present. And I'm concerned about reports of closing embassies and consulates. Where we depart, we create a void for unfriendly actors to step in and promote interests hostile to our interests. Where there is a diplomatic void, we have no eyes, we have no ears to detect the next threat or the next opportunity. And so I want to thank the Department. I want to thank the Department specifically for starting a dialogue with Congress on these reforms and on its policies and on its management more broadly. And some of the proposed reforms that we see here will require legislation, while others can be undertaken administratively. But in both cases, the committee has a significant oversight role to play, as we are doing today. And after our successful work last Congress to get the first state authorities bill signed into law in well over a decade, The committee continues to have some reform ideas of its own, which we look forward to sharing. And I will now turn to our ranking member for Mr. Engel's opening remarks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for calling this hearing, and Mr. Deputy Secretary, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. Thank you for your service and for your time this morning. I was grateful that you hosted the Chairman and myself at the State Department yesterday to discuss your reorganization effort. I'm going to raise some of the concerns this morning that I mentioned to you yesterday. There's no doubt that the State Department and all our federal agencies should be as effective as possible to address the challenges and to seize the opportunities we're facing. This committee has taken some steps to modernize our foreign affairs agencies, including last year's State Department Authorities Bill. There are plenty of good ideas that could bring the State Department, USAID, and our foreign policy into the 21st century. With the Department and Congress working in a bipartisan way, I believe we could get there. But I was troubled that the apparent first step in a reorganization process was the announcement of a 32% cut to our international affairs budget. I know we discussed it yesterday, and I will try to ask you to repeat some of the things you said, a bit more optimistic about that. In my view, I worry about starting with the budget and then finding the reforms is doing things in reverse. To me, it makes more sense to lay out a vision for what modernization looks like, to set clear priorities, to bring in our diplomats, development professionals, and other experts, and then to determine the right budget to get the job done. So I hope in your testimony and afterwards you'll mention some of the things that you mentioned to us yesterday. You'll clarify why the decision was made to start with the dollar figure and work backwards from there. I worry about the reorganization process. I want it to be more transparent and collaborative. I don't think that goes against anything you told us yesterday. The Department has called this an employee-driven process, and I have no doubt that the career employees involved in the exercise have totally honorable intentions. But I understand that those involved are not allowed to discuss the plans with their colleagues, and that the private sector consultants brought on have kept tight control over documents related to the plan. The administration committed to this committee that there would be consultation with Congress every step of the way, and obviously we still have more questions, so I hope we can talk about some of that today. And overall, I must ask, what is the goal of the process? What's the administration's vision for American foreign policy, for America's role in the world, for how the State Department fits into that vision, and for how this process will make the State Department more effective? The only consistent answer that we've gotten is that the Department is finding efficiencies. And I worry when the administration talks about efficiency, that it's just not a code for budget cuts. Cost savings that undermine effectiveness certainly aren't efficient. In the long run, they make America less safe. And as the Department focuses on redesign, I worry the critical day-to-day work of diplomacy is suffering. Far too many senior positions, we talked about this again yesterday, remain vacant, depriving the Department of leadership and making it harder for allies and adversaries alike to know who to call and who's calling the shots in Washington. So I wish you could explain some of that today. Overseas, our diplomats' jobs are getting harder because they can't know if established American foreign policy will be reversed. Morale as the Department continues to suffer as senior career officials flock to the exits. Reports continue to surface of an insular group surrounding the Secretary, uninterested in the input and expertise of our most seasoned professionals. Taken together, America's credibility around the world is wobbling. Our leadership on the global stage seems to be waning, and most importantly, without a strong, functional State Department with a clear foreign policy vision, our interests, values, and security are increasingly at risk. And let me be clear, I do support modernizing the State Department. I want to see it leading and directing American foreign policy. Civilian leadership at the center of national security policy is integral to our democracy at home and to our leadership abroad. For years, Congress has sat on the sidelines when it comes to the State Department. And what do we have to show for it? Antiquated IT systems, personnel shortages that make it harder to address crises or allow for professional development, traditional responsibilities of the Department moving to other agencies like the Pentagon, distracting from its core diplomatic mission. I'm glad that the President sees the necessity for more funds for DOD, but we don't want it at the expense of the State Department, the expense of diplomacy, at the expense of making sure our embassies are safe. In 2020, the Foreign Service Act will be 40 years old. It was written during the Cold War, and the world has changed. We do need to modernize the department. That's why I've instructed my staff to consult with former diplomats, civil servants, and other experts to begin thinking about what states should look like for the next 40 years. I would value the input of any member of this committee as we move forward. And again, Mr. Deputy Secretary, I look forward to your testimony, and I hope you shed some additional light on this process. Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, I ask unanimous consent to place in the record the following documents dealing with the reorganization of the State Department and USAID. The first is a report by Modernizing Foreign Assistance, a new foreign aid architecture fit for purpose. Second is a report from the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition entitled Opportunities for Reforming and Strengthening Diplomacy and Development. The third is a report from the Center for Global Development, a practical vision for U.S. development reform. Next is a report from Refugees International called Honoring a Distinguished Tradition, Crisis Response in U.S. Government Reorganization. And finally, a submission from Amnesty International USA calling on the State Department to preserve the structure, staffing, and resources for the Refugee Bureau, War Crimes Office, and Global Women's Issues Office. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Subject to the length limitations in our rules, without objection, we will put those reports and include them.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now go to our introduction here of Deputy Secretary John Sullivan. Prior to this position, Mr. Sullivan was a partner at the Mayor Brown law firm. He co-chaired its national security practice, and previous to that, Mr. Sullivan served in senior positions at the Justice Department, then at the Defense Department, and the Commerce Department. Without objection, the witness's full prepared statements will be made part of the record. Members are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or any questions or any other extraneous materials that they want to submit for the record here. And we would ask Deputy Secretary Sullivan if you would please summarize your remarks, and then we'll go to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee. Thank you all for inviting me here to discuss the
Secretary Sullivan, let's make sure you push that and then get it very close right there. And everyone will be able to hear you. Perfect.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee. I'm honored to be here today to discuss the redesign of the State Department and USAID. We appreciate the interest the committee has shown in the department's efforts to become better equipped and more effective in serving the American people. On Secretary Tillerson's first day, he promised to deploy the talent and resources of the State Department in the most efficient ways possible. He also committed to harnessing all the institutional knowledge of our workforce to do that. So he went straight to those who know best, our State Department and USAID colleagues, to determine where reform was most needed. From the very beginning, our reform effort has been employee-led. We commissioned a listening survey that produced feedback from more than 35,000 employees, nearly half of our entire global workforce. Hundreds more took part in in-person interviews. We also set up state and USAID web portals for staff to provide regular input and to continue to guide our planning. We've received more than 1,400 submissions to those portals. After hearings from so many of our own colleagues, we convened a cross-section of almost 300 rising leaders and seasoned professionals to create a reform plan. I want to stress that the employee-led nature of the redesign is not an empty slogan. The Secretary wanted employees to drive this process from the beginning so that the Department and USAID can better serve them even as they serve our country. The Redesign Executive Steering Committee, which I chair, is composed of a balance of USAID and State Department leaders. Similarly, the 5 work streams, the groups that drafted the proposals that fed into the reform plan, were comprised almost entirely of career staff posted both in the U.S. and abroad. 72% of workstream members were working-level employees, those who deal with the day-to-day business of diplomacy and development. Their presence and contributions proved to be invaluable. The resulting agency reform plan incorporates the suggestions and feedback from thousands of our public servants serving all over the world. We submitted this plan to OMB earlier this month, consistent with the President's Executive Order 13781, which calls for improvements in efficiencies, effectiveness, and accountability for each federal agency. Let me share with you a few key features of our proposed plan. First, we need to streamline the policy creation process and optimize and realign our global footprint. The world is changing quickly, and state and USAID need to be nimble. That means taking inputs from the field, turning them into evidence-based recommendations, and executing them as quickly as possible. We will use the same approach to assess our physical footprint around the world to ensure that our missions abroad align with our foreign policy priorities. Second, we must maximize the impact and accountability of U.S. foreign assistance. We need to strengthen planning among the 20-plus agencies that provide some type of foreign assistance to make sure our foreign policy goals are focused, integrated, and supported. Third, we need to implement a more effective global service delivery framework to reduce operational costs and redundancies, increase efficiency, and improve service quality for our personnel around the globe. We want to reduce red tape and bureaucratic hurdles by making management and administrative functions do what they were intended to do, support our professionals as they change posts, develop their skills, and serve our country all over the world. Fourth, we need to empower and retain a 21st century workforce by optimizing our HR support. Too often, employees are bogged down trying to navigate broken processes or redundant systems. We envision HR shifting to a more strategic role to help state and USAID attract a more diverse workforce and to invest more in our most valuable assets, our people. Finally, we need to improve our IT platforms, modernize legacy systems, and upgrade our technology infrastructure so that our employees can work anywhere, anytime, and as effectively as possible. We urgently need to integrate our IT systems and cybersecurity platforms. By upgrading our systems and modernizing our technology, we can save money in the long run, reduce overall risks, and facilitate better decision-making in the future. The redesign provides a new foundation for our diplomacy and development professionals. It will also generate significant savings as we streamline processes and increase efficiencies across the department. The proposals we are pursuing will save the American taxpayer a minimum of $5 billion over the next 5 years, with an aspirational whole-of-government target of up to $10 billion. Some of these changes will require further guidance and approval from OMB. Others will require close coordination with other agencies. Still others will require a change in law by Congress. And be assured that for all aspects of the redesign, whether or not a change in law is required, we will consult with this committee and Congress before any actions are taken. We are working to move quickly on the redesign. The reforms that the department can implement internally will be rolled out as soon as possible after consultation with Congress. For example, in the coming months, we hope to move the State Department toward a cloud computing platform and increase the number of Foreign Service family members we employ abroad. Let me emphasize that throughout this process, I commit to consulting closely with this committee. Your input, as always, is most important as we move forward. Therefore, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you this morning about our reform plan and hear your feedback, and I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Sullivan. Let me start. As you know, the State Department Basic Authorities Act requires the department to notify this committee no less than 45 days before closing a diplomatic post. Will the department commit to robust engagement with the committee before you seek to close a diplomatic post, because our members have decades of experience and strong views on this?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate that, and let me emphasize here why I think this is key. Just to follow through on the legislation that we pass in this committee, for example, the legislation we passed on sanctions on North Korea. I explained a little bit of this, but our response to that threat is to have our diplomats make it clear to every country on earth that they've got to cut ties with that rogue regime or suffer the consequences of it. It's our diplomats who have the relationships in these countries throughout the world who follow up and explain directly how seriously the United States takes this. And as I mentioned also in my opening remarks, there are eyes and ears. In northern Nigeria, for example, Boko Haram emerged seemingly out of nowhere. We have no diplomatic presence in all of northern Nigeria, the Muslim population in Africa's most populated country of over 140 million people, because we closed our consulate in Kaduna in the 1990s. The previous administration looked at reopening a consulate in the region, but once closed, posts are very difficult, very expensive to reopen. China certainly isn't trimming back its diplomatic presence there, as you know. Nor in the case of the conversations I had with the governor of that state, where now Boko Haram holds sway, who told me money was flooding into the area from the Gulf states, setting up at that time madrasas to recruit. He told me about one across the street from the madrasa where he got his education, but the new one, young boys were wearing bin Laden t-shirts, and he explained what the consequences were going to be, and he was right. But we have to have that presence on the ground to see these kinds of things coming, and it has to be our Foreign Service that's engaged there. Let me ask you another question, and this goes to this issue of hiring veterans and increasing diversity. The Foreign Service will be the most effective that it can be when it draws on the strengths of the American people. However, it's my understanding that the interview is only offered in Washington, D.C. and in San Francisco. Will the department consider offering the interviews in more places, such as on military bases? If I could ask you that question.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I met, in fact, last week with all of our employee affinity groups, including our veterans group at the State Department, to discuss better ways to recruit for the department to increase our diversity, which is a key goal of the Secretary, as you know.
Yes, and I just, in my opinion, think that if you were to deploy a strategy, and if it was well understood that we were going to do this at military bases, and that those interested in serving the Foreign Service would have that option. I think in terms of the Secretary's commitment to increase efforts to hire veterans and this focus on diversity, this would be a very helpful way to make that happen, and I appreciate your willingness. With that said, let me go to Mr. Engel for his questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I wanted to again thank you for taking the time to meet the Chairman and myself for lunch yesterday. It's very important for this committee and the State Department to have a good working relationship, and I believe the commitments you made yesterday go a long way in advancing a constructive working relationship. We won't always agree, but I think the constructive working relationship is very important. So one thing we discussed, and I'd be grateful if you would reaffirm it here today, is your commitment that the State Department will respond in a timely fashion to the requests for documents and information that come from myself or the Chairman or our staff.
Absolutely, Congressman Engel.
Thank you. I wonder if you would also clarify, as you did yesterday, the Department's policy regarding the necessity of a chairman's letter for certain types of information, so we're clear about that.
Certainly. Subject to legal restrictions imposed because of executive privilege, my policy and the department's policy will be to be as responsive as we can be, both in responding to phone calls, to requests for documents. A call from any member of this committee, a request from any of this committee is a high priority for the State Department. You have my commitment on that, and if we fall down on the job, please let me know, and I'll remedy that situation.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And Secretary Tillerson made the same commitment, and when it wasn't being fulfilled, I went to him again, and he reaffirmed the commitment. So I'm pleased that you're reaffirming that as well. I'd like to read something to you, and I quote, "We will eliminate overlap, set priorities, and fund only the work that supports those priorities. We will empower our people to make decisions and hold them accountable for the results. This begins with the chiefs of mission in our embassies around the world. We will give our chiefs of mission the tools they need to oversee the work of all U.S. government agencies, empower them, and engage them more fully in policy making in Washington." It sounds basic, but it's the kind of change that will help us tap the full potential of our civilian power. That's the end of the quote. Does this sound like it aligns with Secretary Tillerson's vision for improving the department? There is a 2010 QDDR report, and I'm quoting from the 2010 QDDR. Secretary Tillerson recognizes the need for modernization of the State Department, and both of his immediate predecessors saw it as well. But one of the criticisms of the QDDR effort, including from our committee, is that it failed to realize many of its goals. So in my opinion, I'd like to hear your opinion, one of the reasons we failed was a lack of funding. This document is full of important and insightful ideas, but because these ideas were not linked with resources, they didn't lead to the transformation of the department in the ways we had hoped they would. Where the Secretary's reorganization makes this department, State Department, more effective, you'll find enthusiastic support from this committee on both sides of the aisle. But how can the administration carry out real or lasting reforms, including an IT modernization that's currently dramatically under-resourced, when you've tied your hands with respect to the budget?
Well, as we discussed yesterday, Congressman Engel, one of the key goals of the redesign is to empower our men and women, our ambassadors in particular, the chiefs of mission, who are in the field implementing U.S. foreign policy. That's one of our overriding goals. It's been clear from the Secretary's first day on the job. As we also discussed yesterday, the budget process to which you refer started before Secretary Tillerson was confirmed and took office. So he came on board, I followed several months later. We had a budget process that was already underway. The redesign effort, as I've said in other contexts, the Secretary would have been taking this redesign effort even if we'd had a budget increase. It's important for us to find efficiencies in the department, to be good stewards of the taxpayer money, but there will also be areas, as you've noted, where as we go forward, particularly with respect to IT infrastructure, where we will in the future need investments. And the Secretary has made a commitment to the department, and I will repeat it here to this committee, where we need more resources to do our jobs more effectively, we will seek them. IT is one area where I predict we will need assistance in the future in reforming our IT infrastructure.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California, Chairman of the Subcommittee on Europe and Eurasia.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. How many people do you have working at the State Department? What's your payroll like?
At the State Department, Congressman Rohrabacher, we have approximately 75,000 employees worldwide.
How many again?
75,000.
75,000?
Yes, worldwide.
Worldwide. And how many of those, what is the number of people that a president, a new president, political appointees, but brought in by the new president, how many spaces are there for those? There's 75,000 regular employees. How many political appointees are there?
Well, there are a couple of different categories. There are all the ambassadors, so there are approximately 190. Of those, roughly 30% are political appointees. In other words, they're not career Foreign Service officers.
Right.
So that's one category. Then there are positions at the State Department itself, undersecretaries, myself, deputy secretary, assistant secretaries.
Right.
There'd be fewer than 100 of those.
There's only 100.
Approximately.
Okay, and of those 100, how many of those are now filled? How many of those political appointees are sitting now and have their authority?
Those who are now in office, actually at the State Department or in their ambassadorial posts, it would be fewer than 20. That's a rough guess on my part. We have 30 nominees that are pending before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
30 nominees.
30 nominees pending.
And that's for?
For both appointments at the State Department, for example, Undersecretary for Management,
right.
Legal Advisor,
right.
Assistant Secretary for European Affairs. And then we have another category of individuals who have been selected by the administration, but who are undergoing their background investigation and filling out their financial disclosure forms and being reviewed by the Foreign Relations Committee. That would probably be another 20 or 30, I would say, of those.
Okay. So you're saying that about 50 people that could have been appointed by the president are not now
correct
in their positions. So when we say that elections count in this democracy, that we have 50 people now whose slots are being taken by career people until they get there, or actually, are there any appointees from the last administration still in those positions?
To my knowledge, there are no political appointees who are filling those positions. There are, however, career Foreign Service officers who are filling those positions.
All right. And Mr. Chairman, I think that across the board we have seen, we're already into October, and the President of the United States, if our elections, democratic process, mean anything, the President has to have his people in there to help direct policy, because that's who the people voted for. And I think that we are seeing something that I haven't seen for a long time. I've never seen, is that throughout our government, not just State Department, but elsewhere, we have these seats that are vacant that should be presidential appointees. Let me ask you about NGOs and their relationship to the State Department. Do we actually provide services for non-governmental organizations that are active in different countries?
I believe, among other things, we provide financial assistance to NGOs that in turn provide assistance, whether it be life-sustaining food, water, medical assistance. So we will contract with, among others, NGOs for those types of services.
And are NGOs, obviously we have our beliefs and we have certain standards, but when NGOs go into another country, are they required to respect the culture of that country?
That would certainly be expected, Congressman, yes.
Okay. So NGOs, we get complaints. I've gotten complaints as I've traveled around from people that the NGOs are actually out trying to change the country. And of course, we want a certain amount of change, but at some point it becomes a disrespect for the culture of those countries. Good luck in trying to find that line, and good luck in your new position. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
We go now to Brad Sherman, Ranking Member of the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific.
Mr. Deputy Secretary, I want to thank you for your comments about wanting to get information to Congress and answer our questions. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary, was here on June 14th. And of course, we only get 5 minutes, and a lot of us have a lot more questions than that. That's why we have questions for the record. But the questions for the record for the June 14th hearing haven't been answered yet. I wonder if you could commit to having the June 14th questions answered, the vast majority of them by October 15th and all of them by October 31st?
Oh, well, I think I can do better than that, Congressman Sherman. I believe I heard this morning on my way up, and it is strictly a coincidence, I assure you, that those questions, those responses were provided this morning. If there are any that are outstanding, I will make sure that they're provided.
I am eagerly awaiting one of those, and that is, I asked, you're submitting a budget that involves drastic cuts, and the Secretary agreed to say how he would propose spending 10 or 20 or 30% more money than the administration was asking for, because that would give Congress the expert view, or at least the executive branch view, of not only how to spend the amount of money you're talking about, but if we decide how we would allocate more. And I hope that you can commit to answer the QFRs for this hearing within 30 days. Can you do that?
Absolutely.
This reorganization plan, I hope, is not a cover for cuts or a reason to delay filling posts. Others have asked you about that delay. And when it comes to the administration has a muscular tone in its foreign policy. Sanctions are an important part of that. Sanctions are very labor intensive. It's not a matter of just giving a speech at a rally. It's a matter of convincing a Danish or a Dutch bank or government on this deal or that deal. And I would hope that you and the Secretary would convince the President that a muscular foreign policy requires a fully staffed State Department. Tom Lantos was our chairman here. He pushed forward legislation that created the Special Envoy on Global Anti-Semitism. I know your department is committed to filling that post. Can we count on that being filled fairly soon?
You have my word on that, Congressman. If I don't, it's my fault, and I assure you it will be filled promptly.
Okay. Now, there has been a report of a plan to transfer the Bureaus of Population, Refugee, and Migrations and Consular Affairs to the Department of Homeland Security. Can you put those rumors to rest?
I can.
That's not under consideration?
That is not under consideration.
That is a great answer. We have all around the world consulates. The consulates report to the embassy, and the embassy reports to Washington. The one exception to that is our consulate in East Jerusalem, and I wonder whether part of your reorganization could be to have the same policy there as everywhere else and have the consulate in East Jerusalem report to the embassy.
Well, the issue of our embassy in Israel, as you know, is...
Yeah, I'm not asking the bigger question about moving the embassy to Jerusalem. I'm just assuming we keep the facilities that we have now. Would the consulate in East Jerusalem report to the embassy, which is currently located in Tel Aviv?
I would certainly take that under advisement, Congressman.
The department, not everything that relates to foreign policy can be in the State Department. I would hope that you would provide guidance, as you have a process of doing, to the BBG, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, about the importance of broadcasting in the regional languages of Pakistan. I don't have to tell you that this is while North Korea has one language, Pakistan has several, and if you're trying to reach the population of this important country with over 100 nuclear weapons, you can't just broadcast in Urdu and Pashtun. And finally, I'm going to ask you to convey to the Secretary of the Treasury or the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy the importance they have to allocate their time and where to negotiate a tax treaty, and they've been doing it on kind of a paint-by-numbers basis, how big is the GDP of this country or whatever, ignoring the geopolitics. And there are places in the world where having a tax treaty furthers the objectives of the State Department. And your Assistant Secretary of Europe testified in a smaller hearing that having a tax treaty with Armenia is important geopolitically, and I hope we could get that influence over to the Treasury Department.
I'll do so.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Joe Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you,
Carolina.
Mr. Secretary, for being here today. I was very fortunate in August. I was with Congressman Paul Cook on a delegation. We visited Romania, Bulgaria, Latvia, Lithuania, Republic of Georgia, and Poland. And I can report firsthand that all of the State Department personnel who were with us were first class. They were very competent, capable. They connected with this very important new allies of the United States. And so it was just a very uplifting experience in each of those countries. And I was so proud of the dedication of your personnel on behalf of the American people. But I do know that the Foreign Service attracts thousands of applicants each year. However, the Department struggles to effectively recruit Foreign Service officers with a greater diversity of experience, including veterans and those from underrepresented portions of the country. Successive administrations have pledged to increase veteran recruitment with limited success. Does the Department intend to target veterans for recruitment? If so, what reforms to the recruitment process are being considered to reach this goal?
Oh, well, thank you, Congressman Wilson. Yes, recruitment of veterans is a priority for the department. As I discussed earlier with the chairman, one issue that we have discussed is recruitment at military posts. I've met with retired General David Petraeus, who came to speak to our Veterans Affinity Group about this issue, and I've met with our group leader as well.
And many veterans have language skills that could be so helpful, too. Currently, the Department only interviews candidates for the Foreign Service in Washington and San Francisco, not exactly the most representative of U.S. cities. Is the Department considering conducting the oral assessment exam at military bases across the country to encourage veteran hiring?
Yes, we are.
Super, please, that's good. And what other reforms is the Department considering to recruit Foreign Service officers with more diverse backgrounds and skill sets like veterans?
Well, a commitment to diversity is a priority for Secretary Tillerson, and not just with respect to veterans, but with respect to all aspects of American society. The State Department should reflect America, and we're committed to that. Veterans hiring is a priority for us, as I've said, and I've discussed this with Chairman Royce, and we are doing all we can for outreach to veterans, but also to other groups as well who are underrepresented in the State Department.
Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you on that, too. Given the prominent role assigned to the Department by the President's executive order on cybersecurity, I'm concerned about plans to downgrade the Office of the Coordinator for Cyber Issues and merge it with an existing office within the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. At a time when the U.S. is increasingly under attack online, shouldn't the State Department continue to have high-level leadership focused on the whole range of cyber issues, not relegated to economics?
Yes, Congressman Wilson, it is a priority for the Secretary. The move that you discussed for that special envoy is only the first step in our approach to cybersecurity. I've discussed this with the Secretary. We're committed to raising this to a high level within the Department and working with the White House on that issue.
And in fact, the House passed legislation, H.R. 600, the Digital Gap Act, expressing the sense of Congress there should be an Assistant Secretary for Cyberspace to lead the Department's diplomatic cyberspace policy. The Department take into consideration that provision, which effectively calls on the Secretary to elevate the role of cyber diplomacy before there was the provision of downgrading.
Yes, I can commit to you that cybersecurity, our whole cyber effort, will be elevated at the Department beyond the level it is now.
And with that understanding, and we are pleased to learn that the Department's cyberspace functions will continue to focus on a full range of activities beyond just economic issues. Doesn't that call into question your plans to house the office within the Economic and Business Affairs Bureau?
That issue hasn't, the final decision about where and at what level we will place the cybersecurity responsibility hasn't been decided. The initial decision that was made was that for this special envoy office, which exists, we have moved that into that bureau, but that's only the first step in addressing the larger cyber issue that the department needs to, and we will consult with this committee on where the appropriate level is and what bureau it's in before that decision.
Thank you, and I hope you all will be pushing hard on the 30 pending ambassadorships that they be secured as soon as possible. Thank you.
And we go now to Greg Meeks, Ranking Member of the Subcommittee on Europe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, first let me just congratulate and thank you. It seems as though any time that you've been called to come and serve our great country in various administrations, you've done that. And I think that's something to be thankful for. And likewise, you know, when I look at our individuals in the State Department, and I think that we've said it just about unanimously, that no matter where we travel, when we look at the men and women that are in our State Department and how they serve our country, it is just miraculous. And so, you know, a number of us are very concerned when we hear the drastic cuts. And I don't know, when you know, sometimes I get nervous when I hear the word modernization, because I don't know what that means. Does that mean that we're going to get the equipment and make sure we have the new technology that's necessary so that our State Department has all of the tools that it needs to continue to do the great job, the job that it often does with, you know, its hands tied? Or does it mean that we're going to have to cut personnel and make their jobs even more difficult than it already is? Because they have tough jobs. And I think it's General Mattis that says the more that we take away from the State Department, the more we have to put into DOD. So, you know, we're nervous. And as I travel, I think that a number of the employees in the State Department are nervous. I listened to your opening statement where you said that, and I see that 66% of the individuals responded, but they still don't know what the final plan is, and the information flow has not gotten down. So, you know, there seems to be a lot of morale problems now because they don't know the uncertainty. They don't, you know, whether or not what they have recommended would be heard. And then when we have what took place, for example, what concerned me at the UN this past last week at the United Nations in New York, where I believe there was some 140 officials that were there, and it was down from twice that number the year prior. And when I look at before, it was consistent because here was an opportunity to have our diplomats in the State Department working with all of these heads of states at various levels. That's how this works. So when I see that kind of reduction, that to me means that there's difficulty in getting our diplomacy out and talking and working with these other governments. So can you tell me, you know, is that going to be the trend where we're going to see less numbers of diplomats and people from the State Department that are going out to promote our diplomacy, as we just saw exhibited at the UN last week?
Absolutely not, Congressman. I approached this job, when I interviewed with Secretary Tillerson, I spoke to him of my enormous respect and regard for the Foreign Service, and it comes from my family. My family, my uncle served in the Foreign Service. My father's brother, 32 years in the Foreign Service. He was actually our last U.S. ambassador to Iran. It was his staff that was taken hostage on November 4th. So I understand the burdens that Foreign Service and our civil service face when they are posted abroad. I committed to Secretary Tillerson. Secretary Tillerson is committed to the department that our goal is to empower those women and men in the Foreign Service and the civil service who serve the United States abroad in dangerous places on our behalf with little thanks. And our men and women in uniform are absolutely deserving of our respect and admiration and thanked for their service. But our Foreign Service and Civil Service officers are equally deserving of that respect and thanks because they serve just as our military does in dangerous places.
Absolutely, and again, thank you. So, I mean, then the other decision that kind of puzzled me a little bit, that it's been reported that after initially turning down funding for the Global Engagement Center that focuses on anti-propaganda efforts. Secretary Tillerson approved the request for the transfer of $40 million from DOD. And I think the two should be. I don't want to, to get involved in the other. The State Department deserves to have its own funding. Can you tell me why the State Department is relying on DOD funding for its own civilian efforts to combat terrorism and propaganda from hostile governments?
Certainly, Congressman Meeks. Let me clarify that. There is an appropriation for our Global Engagement Center that is State Department money, and we are spending that money. A separate statute authorized the department to seek from the Department of Defense an additional amount of money which Defense could transfer to us. That's the $40 million that we sought. So we have our own money. We sought an additional $40 million from the Defense Department, and that's because the way Congress wrote the law, we had to ask the Defense Department for the money. We did, and it's been transferred to us.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
We go now to Mr. Mark Meadows of North Carolina. I don't think he's with us at the moment. Adam Kinzinger of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, sir, for being here. Thanks for your service to your country, and it's very much appreciated. I think state USAID are sometimes the unsung heroes of conflict mitigation, and in many ways we never see some of the success they provide because it's in a lack of a war, for instance, which is hard to quantify. My colleague mentioned the Global Engagement Center. I just want to drill a little deeper on that, if you don't mind, sir. You mentioned the $40 million coming from DOD. So I just want to clarify, you are accepting the $80 million then that was written into statute now, and so that would be a total of $120 million in essence. Is that what you're saying?
We have requested and received from the Defense Department $40 million. We have our own appropriated funds, which we are also applying to the Global Engagement Center's mission.
Okay, so that is happening then.
Right.
And how does that, so if you look at kind of your overall idea of redesign or fixing the State Department, I would say, how does the Global Engagement Center figure into your redesign plans? Where do you guys see this going? What are some of the benefits you see in terms of pushing back against the propaganda from our Eastern friends, I guess, or non-friends, competitors?
The Global Engagement Center figures prominently in our public diplomacy in countering the malign activities of terrorist organizations, whether it's ISIS, Al-Qaeda, their affiliates. That has been the mission traditionally of the Global Engagement Center since it was created by Congress. The new aspect of our mission and the $40 million which we've gotten from the Defense Department is to counter state efforts at propaganda, so Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, which is a different form of mission. The GEC was initially focused on terrorist organizations. It's now also focused on state efforts at propaganda. Both are important, both are being funded properly, and both will figure prominently in our public diplomacy going forward.
Good, and maybe you can respond to this, or maybe I'll just state it for the record. I think the intention of Congress and the $80 million was to really focus on the counter-propaganda efforts of Russia, because as we've seen, and our various friends in Eastern Europe, they're the victims of a lot of this, and we've seen the victim of that, in fact, here on our own shores, and so I think that's essential. And I also firmly believe that the State Department, as I mentioned, and USAID are unsung heroes in conflict mitigation, and I think rather than hindering our diplomats and aid professionals, we need to provide them with greater flexibility and capacity to operate in conflict zones so we can work to provide hope and opportunity to the 7- and 8-year-olds that we see right now in refugee camps, which I call it the next generational war on terror. And it could either lead to guns and bombs, or it can lead to, frankly, a generation that rises up to reject terror within their own communities. And I think that's, frankly, how you are going to actually win this. I think bombs and guns are important in the current fight, but I think we have to look at that next generation, because this could be a war that we're engaged in for the rest of my life, and something I think is essential. So how does the redesign, in your mind, offer solutions for increasing state and USAID's flexibility and capacity to operate in conflict zones like Syria or elsewhere?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Congressman, about the challenge we face with refugees, whether it's refugee camps in Jordan from the conflict in Syria, the refugee crisis we see now on the border of Burma and Bangladesh. Those enormous refugee populations are a global problem and will continue to be unless it's properly addressed. We have at the State Department modest means, not the complete means to address them. It's a global problem. Right. So, for example, in Burma, we've spent $32 million now to start to address the refugee crisis there. Our ambassador in Burma is looking to go up to the Rakhine state to get to the border within the next 2 days. We're doing all we can to address that problem there. We've spent large sums of money to address the refugee crisis that's been generated by the rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And with partners and allies, with the help of the Jordanian government, which has done a heroic amount of work, we're trying to do all we can to address that problem because, as you know, this is a generational problem, and this is going to be a problem that will face us for years to come.
Thank you. And since my time's running out, I won't ask the question, but I will make the statement. As you guys are looking at diplomatic outposts maybe to consolidate or shut down, I think it's important to remember we didn't have a diplomatic post in Afghanistan pre-9/11. And so a lot of the areas when we look at around the world where to do this, we need to be thinking, and I know you're thinking of this, Mr. Secretary, not in terms of the conflict today, but what could potentially be a conflict tomorrow and the benefit of having a presence there. Again, for conflict mitigation, which we can't quantify how many conflicts we've stopped with state or USAID. But again, I want to thank you and the people that work for you for your hard work for the American people. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you.
Albio Series of New Jersey is the ranking member on the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today. And thank you for being here and the work that you do to serve this country and all the people that work for you. I get a chance to travel quite a bit, and they are professional. They are working hard every day, and quite frankly, some of them are in real dangerous situations, and I'm concerned. So, and I just want to thank you for the coincidence of answering our questions that happened this morning. We submitted about 3 months ago the questions, and I get concerned. Go ahead, sir.
There's nothing like a congressional hearing to focus the concentration.
A coincidence, right?
That's just an observation.
I get concerned when we throw our numbers like 30% that we're going to have this kind of cut in the State Department. You can imagine what it does to the people that work for you, and you can imagine what it does for the countries that we deal with. And one of the things that really concerns me is this hiring freeze and how it impacts the family members that work for these people. Some of these people are not going to be able to work. And it's hard enough already for some of the employees, you know, with the salary that they get to make ends meet in some of these places. But now you have a situation where even their family members cannot be employed if we implement this 30%. So can you talk a little bit about that? Even schooling of the children.
Sure.
I mean, that's all part of it.
Absolutely. The employment of family members at U.S. embassies abroad is vitally important, not just for the support, the monetary support it provides for those families, but for the services that those family members provide to our embassy. So we've had a hiring freeze in place. There was an administration-wide hiring freeze. The department has continued that hiring freeze until we've got a better handle on our redesign. There are a lot of exceptions, though, to that hiring freeze. Among them has been an exception for the employment of family members. I believe the numbers are we've employed, since the hiring freeze went into effect, we've brought on somewhere between 800 and 900 authorized family members to work at our embassies. It's a consistent concern I hear from our ambassadors when they come back from post to Washington and I meet with them. Employment of family members at embassies is always a topic they raise.
And schooling, too.
Schooling as well.
You know, that's what we hear also when we
Right.
travel. Can you, I hate to bring this into this Cuban foreign affairs situation, but I know that Tillerson is meeting with some of the Cuban diplomats in Havana, or is that correct? Or when is that happening?
We've had regular contact with the government of Cuba. If you're referring to the acoustic incidents that have been happening
I was coming to
in
that.
Havana, we've had regular contact to register our deep concern with what's happened in Havana, and to remind the Cuban government of its obligation under the Geneva Convention to protect our embassy employees and their families down there.
Yeah, we've been trying to get a briefing schedule, and we can't seem to get it on where we are with this acoustic situation from the State Department.
If you need a briefing, Congressman, I will guarantee you, this committee, whoever wants a briefing will get one, and we can, our staff can perhaps speak with the chairman after this hearing, and we will arrange to get the information you need to understand what's happening in Havana at our embassy.
I'm also concerned about the crisis in Venezuela and our role with the OAS. How involved are we with the OAS?
I actually had the honor to represent the United States at the OAS General Assembly in Cancun in late June. There was a diplomatic accomplishment by the United States and our allies at that meeting, where we got over 20 countries in the region to back a resolution on Venezuela. Unfortunately, we didn't reach the 2/3 threshold to get that resolution passed.
So my time is running out. I'm just wondering if some of these cuts, you think is going to impact our ability to do something like this in the future?
Absolutely not. We will not.
These countries are all frightened. I don't want to interrupt. I mean, they're all frightened that all these cuts are going to take place, and we're not going to be as active as we've been in the Western Hemisphere, which I work with.
Yes, no, it is, Venezuela in particular is a priority for this administration, and we will continue to work hard on that topic and bring pressure to bear on the Maduro government, which is, as you know as well as anyone, has really driven the Venezuelan country, its economy, into dire straits.
Will the gentleman yield? Might I suggest, you're the ranking member on Western Hem, that we formalize the request right now to the State Department concerning a private briefing for the members here with respect to the concerns our Foreign Service officers have who were stationed in Havana with respect to some of the health issues that they've raised, so that we can learn about the ongoing discussions here.
We will undertake to have that briefing for you.
We appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for making that suggestion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, and for your testimony and being with us today, and thank you, Mr. Series. We now go to Dan Donovan of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, let me add my sincere gratitude to your service to our nation as well. Recognizing we're not appropriators, in your efforts to redesign the State Department to better serve our nation's interests throughout the globe, is there anything that this committee can do legislatively or anything to help in those efforts?
Well, we'll have a number of requests that will come to this committee on with respect to our redesign effort. Just to give you an example, we've shared with the committee a letter from the Secretary that sets forth proposals for all of the special envoys that we have. It's almost 70. Some of those offices were created by statute, and what we propose to do with them in consultation with the committee may require legislation to effect change. So we will be coming to this committee with changes that we seek to help us with our redesign, and we very much want to, A, cooperate with you and consult with you on these proposed changes, but we will need legislation for some of them as well.
Thank you. Recognizing that a stable globe is very much in the interest of the United States national security, our homeland security, and that's the other committee that I serve on besides Foreign Affairs. Is there any redesign efforts that you're contemplating now involving USAID?
Yes, there are substantial redesign proposals that are under consideration. However, I should state up front, one of them is not merging AID into the State Department. So we have a number of proposals that we're considering with input from senior AID officials to make AID more efficient, to align our development policy with our foreign policy as we go forward. But we are not considering at this point merging AID into the State Department.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you.
We go now to Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Secretary Sullivan, thanks for being here, and thank you for your service. Secretary Tillerson told our committee in June that throughout this redesign process, he said, we will work as a team and with Congress. And with all due respect, this has not felt like a team effort. Modernizing the State Department so that it can be as effective as possible in advancing national security and promoting U.S. interests abroad is a shared goal. But many of us, as you've heard today, are worried that this whole process is simply a downgrading of our diplomacy by another name. President Trump's proposed 30% cut of the State Department is particularly dangerous at a time when we need deft diplomacy and skilled statesmen to address the threats from Iran and North Korea, to promote peace in the Middle East, to push back against Russian aggression both in Ukraine and, frankly, here at home. And at a time when foreign diplomats speak openly about how they look to the White House because the State Department is so understaffed, I'd like to ask you, the State Department, about a few specific foreign policy topics to get an understanding of the administration's position. First, in the Middle East, we saw a brutal reminder of the challenges that Israel faces in its search for peace today when a terrorist killed 3 Israelis and seriously wounded others near Jerusalem. Meanwhile, in Gaza, Hamas continues to hold the bodies of slain IDF soldiers and Israeli civilians as bargaining chips. Earlier this month, I met with the parents of Lieutenant Hadar Golden, who was killed by Hamas terrorists using an underground terror tunnel during a ceasefire in 2014. I've also met with the family of Sergeant Aron Shaul, who was also killed by Hamas in 2014. Hamas's refusal to return the bodies of these soldiers to their families for burial is an obvious violation of international law and basic human values. So to where we are today. Jason Greenblatt is currently in Israel, continuing the administration's push towards peace, but for many of us, we're still in the dark about what that looks like. Mr. Greenblatt said last week that it is no secret our approach to these discussions departs from some of the usual orthodoxy. For after years of well-meaning attempts to negotiate an end to the conflict, we have all learned some valuable lessons. So what I'd ask you, Deputy Secretary Sullivan, is what are those lessons that have been learned? What are the unorthodox approaches that you're pursuing? And is it this administration's intention to present its own peace plan?
Oh, thank you, Congressman. Yes, as you know, the White House, Jason Greenblatt, the President's special representative, the senior advisor to the President, Jared Kushner, have been very deeply involved in negotiations between this administration and the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority. The President met with Prime Minister Netanyahu with the leadership of the Palestinian Authority last week. The President himself is personally committed to this process, as other presidents have been. I think the commitment of this administration is clear to the peace process. I would have to defer to Mr. Greenblatt on what he specifically meant with those comments. I would say that Secretary Tillerson, though, has been involved as well. He was with President Trump when the President visited Israel in June.
All of which we're aware of. Can you tell us whether it's the President's intention, the administration's intention to present its own peace plan?
I would have to defer to the White House on that, sir.
Next, moving on to Iran, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs said in July that it appears Iran is in compliance with the rules that were laid out in the JCPOA. Now, there are very real flaws in the JCPOA, including the problematic sunset provisions. However, in order to lead an international effort against Iran's ongoing support for terrorism, their support of the Hezbollah militias in Syria, the development of their missile program, all of which are outside the terms of the JCPOA, we're going to need the support of the international community and our allies and partners in Europe. Wouldn't a decision not to certify compliance because of factors that are outside the JCPOA risk isolating us from our allies and making the job of combating Iran's malign activities in the region even more difficult?
Well, the Secretary has said as late as last week that Iran is in technical compliance with the JCPOA. He said as well, however, that Iran is in violation of the spirit of the JCPOA for all the malign activities that you've just described. We've been in close consultation with our allies to address both those malign activities and the flaws in the JCPOA, including the sunset provision. So the President will have a decision in October on whether to certify or not, but our work on Iran's malign activities and trying to improve the terms of the JCPOA will continue.
And finally, Mr. Chairman, just if I may, my last question. As you know, Deputy Secretary Sullivan, Bob Levinson's now been held by Iran for more than 10 years. The Levinsons were told that the UN General Assembly would be used as an opportunity to push forward Bob's case. Are you seeing any progress, and can you commit to us here that bringing Bob and the other Americans being unjustly and cruelly held by Iran will remain a priority for this administration?
The Levinson case is a priority for this administration, as are all the other American hostages held worldwide. Just as a note, I have met and spoken with the Levinson family on multiple occasions. I have a picture on my desk of Bob Levinson, who reminds me every day that he's our longest held hostage in Iran. And I have personal family experience with Americans being held hostage in Iran. This administration has no higher priority than bringing home all of those Americans, including Mr. Levinson. Right. You have my word on that.
And I'm profoundly grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
We go to Lee Zeldin of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today and for your service to our country. The rising tide of anti-Semitism, both here in the United States and abroad, is of great concern for myself, for many of my constituents, for many Americans. The U.S. State Department's office responsible for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism has how many active members currently?
I would have to get you that answer after this hearing. I can't tell you off the top of my head, Congressman. I apologize.
And previously, in responding to a question from one of my colleagues, you mentioned filling the special envoy position as a top priority for the State Department. Are there potential candidates being vetted? Where are we in that process? How imminent is this?
Yes, there are candidates being vetted. Unfortunately, because a final decision hasn't been made, I can't disclose those names or where things stand, but you have my commitment that that position will be filled promptly.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. How many undersecretary and assistant secretary positions are there at the State Department? Is it about 30?
There are 6 undersecretaries. Assistant secretaries, there are more than 30, I believe.
Yeah. Do you know how many of those positions are filled as of right now?
Filled with confirmed office holders. I can't give you a precise number. It's well below 50% and far fewer than it should be, and that is not a good. We are not pleased with that situation.
And I want to see you be successful. I want to see Secretary Tillerson be successful, and I believe very strongly that it's very important for those positions to all get filled. We're here now at the end of September, and this first year for Secretary Tillerson is pretty close to an end. As you know better than I do, a lot of these positions get filled up with acting heads of these different offices, and I think that you all would be much more successful to fill those as quickly as possible. What's the timeline and goal for getting the remainder of these positions filled?
Well, as I mentioned earlier in the hearing, we have 30 nominees that are pending now before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We have in the pipeline, so to speak, individuals who are undergoing vetting for many more positions. My hope is, subject to the Senate calendar, that we will get the vast majority of these positions filled by the end of November or beginning of December. But it's we're behind the curve. We should be ahead of the curve, and we're doing all we can to catch up.
Thank you for that. I'm very much appreciate the administration's efforts, the State Department's efforts, Ambassador Haley's efforts at the United Nations as it relates to North Korea. I know that it's a very challenging situation. The timeline keeps shrinking of how quickly North Korea can get to that point where they have the capability to deliver a nuclear warhead to the United States, and that the State Department is working hard on getting multilateral diplomacy, ramping up economic pressure, the information effort within North Korea so that they understand that it's their own regime responsible for many of their struggles. And it's no small feat what the administration has pulled off at the United Nations in getting a unanimous vote, including Russia and China, on a massive sanctions package, bringing China to the table more than ever before. And because the military option is absolutely the last possible option that anyone should want to consider, because there really is no good military option, I greatly appreciate everything that you're working on to increase that pressure and try to deal with the North Korea situation. And while it may not get covered as much in the news, all those victories with regards to bringing China and Russia on board, I just want to let you know, on behalf of myself and my constituents, very grateful for your achievements so far, and I wish you much success because it's certainly far from over. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Sullivan. You said that this is an employee-led effort, a visionary document with no predetermined outcomes. How can you say that when the President's budget already recommended a 32% cut to our State Department budget and USAID budget estimated to slash $5 to $10 billion over the next 5 years?
Well, I distinguish.
I mean, was that a bottom-up recommendation?
No, that's the President's budget.
You need to speak into the mic.
That's the President's budget,
right,
which we have to live with, and it's also a budget that's passed by Congress ultimately. So we deal with the budget that we have, with the amounts that have been appropriated for this year and going forward. Apart from that, as I said earlier, whether or not we were going to have a budget decrease or increase.
I'm sorry, I only have 5 minutes. I take your point. But candidly, if you're going to have a bottom-up reorg for the State Department and AID, and they already know there's going to be a third cut, leading to the attrition or the layoff of somewhere probably north of 2,000 employees, I'd say that puts a little damper on my enthusiasm on the bottom-up effort to reorganize State Department, because I'm worried about my own job security, and I wonder how sincere the effort is if in advance I've already been told what the parameters are.
The budget parameters are only one aspect of the redesign.
Pretty big, important one, though, isn't it?
It is an important one, as is our...
And it sends a message, doesn't it? I mean, what kind of message does that send to these the bottom-up process to those employees in terms of the value of their work?
The message that the Secretary has sent to those employees, the 75,000 men and women of the Department of State, is they are enormously valued by him, by us, and their service is recognized every day.
Well, I'm sure he means it, but to some employees, especially many I represent in my district, it sounds like empty rhetoric, frankly, Mr. Sullivan, because the fact is we got a president and a budget that would cut a third of their budget. And that doesn't seem like a real high value being put on their work. Would you argue that in the course of this process, morale's high at the State Department and the USAID?
No.
Why not?
I think there's uncertainty. We're doing our best to reduce that uncertainty. This testimony by me today is part of that process. I've had a town hall meeting with employees. I've had small group meetings with employees. The Secretary has initiated a regular outreach, both by email and in person with employees. We're doing all we can now to reassure them that this process is employee-led, they are valued, and diplomacy is valued by this government and by this Secretary.
So okay, good to hear. I hope they believe it. And I hope the actions corroborate what you've just said. Do you believe that USAID should be folded into the Department of State, or is that still an open question?
No. No.
No, it's an open question?
It is not. No, it is not an open question. As I testified earlier today, there is no intention to merge AID into the State Department.
Do you believe that AID should be, in fact, enhanced, the role of the aid administrator enhanced as the lead development officer of the United States government?
I believe that the role of AID should be enhanced, made more effective and more efficient.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that, actually. I have a bill maybe you want to take a look at that would do just that.
I'd be happy to.
Because part of the problem I'm concerned about is that over the years we've seen sort of a diffusion of things, all with good purpose, whether it be aid, HIV/AIDS, whether it be Africa, whether it be other special programs to help certain mid to advanced countries. And what it's done is disperse the focus of U.S. development assistance. And it seems to me that that's not a very good management model. So I'd be glad to work with you on, and hope you will work with us in trying to take a fresh look at that. Do you believe that, well, let me ask this question. We have a famine going on in Africa right now. Do you believe that AID and the State Department are currently well equipped to respond to that famine? And then my time is up.
We are not doing as much as we should be to respond to that famine. We should do and will do more.
Thank you, and thanks for your refreshing testimony. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ann Wagner of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I thank you, Deputy Secretary Sullivan, for making the time to be with us today. I appreciate your leadership and am keen to watch the State Department redesign process unfold. As a former United States ambassador who spent 4 years at State, I am well aware that State Department is a bloated bureaucracy, and reassessing everything from hiring to diplomatic programming to cutting unnecessary departments is critical to advancing U.S. diplomacy into the 21st century. I believe that we can balance State Department's checkbook while promoting American leadership and strength. And I trust you and Secretary Tillerson to make those difficult calls. One of my longtime concerns is that State Department deployments are not well balanced to reflect the importance of American leadership in the Asia-Pacific in particular. Despite the U.S. rebalance to Asia, it appears that we still have very large embassies in Western nations where I served. And relative to the conflict that we're facing, insufficient staff at our Asia postings. Are you considering rebalancing the number of Foreign Service officers who are posted in China, South Korea, India, and the ASEAN nations to account for our interests in the Asia-Pacific?
Yes, absolutely, Congressman Wagner. That's one of the priorities of the redesign, is to rebalance our footprint. The chairman raised the issue of closing posts. It's not so much closing posts as
rebalancing, correct.
Exactly.
What's our time frame, sir?
The redesign, we're looking at implementing, subject to consultations with this committee and others in Congress over the next several months. The rebalancing will be a process that is ongoing, and it should start immediately and continue through our tenure in office. I think it will be an ongoing process as challenges rise and we find the need to have more Foreign Service officers, civil service officers at particular posts.
Let me shift gears here a little bit, Mr. Secretary. The last administration fought to lift sanctions against Burma and give the country GSP status. But violence has raged on, and we're going to be having, thanks to the leadership of Chairman Yoho, a hearing on that this week. How is the State Department actively responding to the ethnic cleansing of Rohingya Muslims in Burma? And how will the U.S. protect this persecuted community?
Well, our outreach has started at the top with Secretary Tillerson, and our ambassador is working very hard and looking to go up to the region this week. We've committed already $32 million to address the crisis, more to follow, and a lot more intensive effort for our department, because this is, as I testified earlier, it's not a Burma problem, it's not a problem for Bangladesh or the United States, it's a global problem. The scale is tragic.
I agree, and timely also, as we've seen 400,000 refugees in the last week move on to Bangladesh. Syrian civil defense rescue workers have reported that they've been directly targeted by Russian forces, even though they are in a ceasefire zone and should be protected by medical neutrality. What is State Department doing to address violence committed by Russia in Syria?
We've established a military-to-military chain of communication. The U.S. Department of Defense, from the chairman on down, has been in contact with their equivalents in the Russian Defense Ministry. That coordination and deconfliction has, for the most part, over the course of this summer, worked well. But there have been breakdowns, including recent breakdowns, that we are addressing immediately in person with our military's Russian counterparts.
Good. Well, I thank you in that, and I will yield back my time. And
will the gentlelady yield for?
Yes, I will. I just want to say that if you are interested in input from a member of Congress who served at the State Department in your rebalancing efforts, I have a lot of ideas. So I yield back my time.
Look forward to hearing them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate the ambassador, Mrs. Wagner, yielding. The question she brought up about the Rohingya issue is one that I raised with you yesterday and raised with the Secretary of State, and that is we have to figure out a way to get across to the military government in Burma that they have to pull the militia out and the military out that are engaged right now in burning those villages. There are 400,000 Rohingya people who have fled over the border, as you know, into Bangladesh. They need to be welcomed back in. It's not enough to have statements from the counselor. She is not commander-in-chief. Their system reserved that for their military in Burma. And this requires not just international pressure, but a very focused amount of pressure on the Burmese government to get USAID, get the UN in terms of being able to assist those in Rakhine State who have faced this ethnic cleansing, and also requires the press being on the ground. So again, I just reiterate the important role that we must play in achieving this. We have a hearing coming up, I think, later this week on this subject. I also just wanted to raise an issue. Karen Bass and I were yesterday with the Liberian president. Now, that election is a month away, and so let me just put this question to you. I understand one of the things you're trying to do is get the versatility to be able to transfer or get the reforms in place where you can quickly do a deployment. So if we have more people in the embassy in Switzerland than we do in Liberia, and Liberia has an election next month, can you deploy right now from Europe, because we've been a decade late in making these realignments, can you deploy to the ground to make sure that fair and free elections, which is what is trying to be engineered here by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president of Liberia, takes place?
We can, but it's a huge challenge for us. I'll give you an example. The recent elections in Kenya, a huge logistical undertaking by the Department of State. We're going to have to go through this again when the new elections occur. We're going to have to do this in Liberia. It's a logistical challenge for us. We need more flexibility and authorities to do that, and it's part of when we talk about
let us know precisely now. We understand how long the wait is going to be here, and then the OMB is going to review. Let us know this aspect of it now, so that I and the ranking member and Congresswoman Bass and Mr. Smith can work on legislation to specifically rectify this situation immediately. And I appreciate that. We go to Congresswoman Karen Bass of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, especially for your leadership on these issues. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to ask you 3 quick questions. One, I wanted to ask you about the diversity fellowships, and let me begin by saying that I really appreciated Secretary Tillerson's statement, and I appreciate the timing that he made the statement as well, the State Department's commitment to diversity. So specifically, I wanted to ask you about the Rangel Fellows and the Payne Fellows, and I wanted to ask, and I don't want to assume, but that those fellowships will be continued.
Yes, Congresswoman Bass, those fellowships will be continued and are very important to our efforts in bringing in new talent to the department.
Thank you very much. In August, Secretary Tillerson sent a letter to several members of Congress effectively stating that the Assistant Secretary, the Acting Assistant Secretary for the Africa Bureau already fulfills the responsibilities that have previously been performed by the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan and South Sudan. And I know one of my colleagues asked you a question about special envoys earlier, but I wanted to specifically ask if that is going to be the case, if the special envoy will be eliminated for Sudan, and in particular South Sudan, considering the instability in that nation.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Bass. I believe that's one of the special envoy positions for which we would need a statutory change. So we will need to come to this. I could be wrong about that, and I'll have to get back to you to confirm, because I'm just relying.
So that means as of now you can't change it?
We have to seek, if we were to make changes to that office, I believe we would require a change to the statute.
Good. We'll follow up on that as well. And then a few moments ago, when my colleague was asking you about the famine, you said that we could be doing more.
Yes.
And I was wondering what your opinions were. We did authorize in the CR a couple of months ago close to $1 billion. And I went to the region with Mr. Smith, and I was wondering, one, has all of that money been allocated, and is it on the ground? We were concerned that some of it would be used as carryover, and we didn't want to see that happen.
I will get you the precise figures, Congresswoman Bass. I would be disappointed in the extreme if it's not.
Okay.
But I will confirm that for you.
I would appreciate that. I'd like the figures, and I'd like to know where. Of
course.
Considering it was spread over 4 countries. And then also a minute ago you were referencing the the election rather in Kenya.
Yes.
I was there as an observer, and you mentioned that we had to deploy a lot. What did we do? Because I didn't see that.
Diplomatic security, among other things, for election monitors. So there were a number of groups that came to monitor the elections.
Right. And that I was part of that. We provided diplomatic security?
Yeah,
I know you did for me.
The diplomatic security, in fact, I met with diplomatic security about their needs, the requirements for diplomatic security made by the embassy in advance of the election went well beyond what we would have otherwise anticipated for that embassy. So there was a substantial commitment of security resources to make sure that Americans would be protected in the event that there had been violence, which is as there had been in the 2 elections prior.
I see. So then the diplomatic security you were referring to was housed at the embassy.
There were also posts around the country where we had other Americans that were we needed to protect.
And Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, when you were referring to support needed in Liberia, were you referring to diplomatic security, or what were you referring to?
Well, because the election on the ground is going to require all kinds of monitoring, it is a good opportunity to have the full comportment of security in place, but also engagement on the part of the United States. I imagine we're going to try to have NDI and IRI on the ground. all of that requires a tremendous amount of, you and I have both been involved, I think, in the past. I've been involved in these elections where you come in, you spend, a week, and you try to engage in making certain that everything is in place for what is going to be a tremendously complicated undertaking. And to the extent that you've got the staff there from the U.S. Embassy to assist, it's very important. So what's at risk here is being able to get the ability, the discretion on the part of the Secretary of State to move personnel. And unfortunately, we're sort of locked in. And that is something that I think we could all agree on would be a necessary change. You might not like the transfer momentarily, temporarily from Switzerland to, to a situation where you had the war-torn results where we're trying post-conflict to, have another successful election there. But that should be the decision of those of us in Congress with oversight responsibility and our Secretary of State. And that's where I'm trying to drive the policy.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and I'll await your responses about the famine.
Yes,
thank you. Yield back.
We go now to Ted Yoho of Texas. Oh, Francis Rooney of Florida. Ambassador Rooney's here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'm glad to read that you're going to upgrade IT. I think when I was serving in Rome, we had like Windows -1. Oh, did I mix it up? Ted, you go ahead. No, you go ahead. I said, okay. You have the time. Okay. All right, well, just one quick question. There's been some discussion about the consular activities maybe going to Homeland Security. And, we have 40% of the people in this country illegally overstayed visas, and 700,000 people overstayed their visas last year. So the question I have is, can the State Department adequately deal with the overstay problem in the United States, or should that part go to Homeland Security?
I think the overstay problem here in the United States is something that should be and is being addressed by the Department of Homeland Security. I think consular affairs and the role of the consular officer at the embassy in screening visa applicants and so forth is an important function of the Department of State. So there is no plan to transfer consular affairs to DHS, but there is definitely an overstay problem.
Okay, thank you. That's all I was going to ask about. Thank you.
We go now to Mr. Bill Keating, Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the Deputy Secretary. I enjoyed our conversation before. The second of the proposals that you had was maximizing the impact of foreign assistance or aligning foreign assistance with foreign policy goals. And here's a question I have. We had a question earlier on by one of our members about respecting culture, and we've also had President Trump signal maybe some changes in terms of how we approach autocratic regimes, sort of just leaving them alone or not being as involved as we were. Could you comment, is this a change in our foreign policy? Because my understanding has always been that our foreign policy goals reinforce our basic American values like rule of law, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, human rights, civil rights, gender equality, respect for minorities in those cultures. Now, is that a change, frankly? Is there the President's remarks, as well as maybe the thoughts behind the question of respecting culture? When we're dealing with these autocratic regimes that act at odds with basic American values, are we going to still reinforce those values? And indeed, is that going to be something that's factored in when we're aligning foreign assistance to these countries?
Yes, Congressman Keating. Our American values are, for us at the State Department, and for me as an American, they're immutable. And we're committed to them. And it's a difficult line we walk in dealing with foreign governments that have different institutions and cultures, and we walk a fine line. But let me give you an example to support my my contention that we don't have a change in policy. For example, our foreign military FMF program with Egypt, Secretary has withheld $195 million. It's been notified, it's been obligated to be spent, but it is being withheld until the Egyptians show some progress on issues related to human rights with, for example, the treatment of NGOs. It's an issue we confront every day, and we have to walk a fine line, but we never deviate from our values. We protect Americans' national security, promote our prosperity, but never undermine our values.
Well, thank you for reaffirming that. And in terms of the NGOs and working with them, as the State Department, when they're reducing some of the budget items they have, is that going to affect the collaboration with NGOs and non-governmental organizations on the ground because of the hiring freeze or reorganization? We will still be able to support a very robust engagement with these NGOs when they reflect these American values. Do you see that these changes in budget cuts or reorganization affecting that arrangement?
There wouldn't be any policy to change our relationship with NGOs. There may be incident to changes in our budget where our relationship with a particular NGO might change, but we will continue to implement UN foreign policy, particularly development assistance, as necessary through NGOs.
And the Women, Peace, and Security Act passed the Senate and just passed the House, and it's on its way to the President's desk right now. And that makes sure that women are meaningful participants at all levels of foreign policy making and implementation, and requires commitment and resources to do that. With that reaching the President's desk, is that something, again, that we're going to reaffirm because that policy change is something that was in place in the last administration? Is that going to carry forward?
I think the senior advisor to the President, Ivanka Trump, would strongly reaffirm that that's the policy of this administration, as the President would. We're committed to that at the Department of State. One thing I'd note for you, Congressman, is that one thing that's astounded me is, in talking about diversity at the State Department, the number of women we have in the Foreign Service and the Civil Service has actually decreased, particularly at the senior levels, over the last 8 years or so. We've got to do a better job on promoting women in the State Department, in our Foreign Service, and we're committed to it.
Great. Thank you for making sure that's clear and for reaffirming that. And thank you for your presence, and I look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Representative Ted Yoho, Florida, Chairman of the Asian Pacific Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you being here, Deputy Secretary Sullivan. I was at a meeting, probably a year ago, and there was a lot of the current and retired generals in there talking about a major world tectonic shift in world powers that we haven't seen since 1942. And the State Department being around since 1889 as the first cabinet agency. With you in the position you're in now, you're able to step back, look at the State Department as a whole, probably that it's never been looked at before, and reform. And I would have to ask, when was the last time there's been a major transformation or reform of the State Department?
There have been efforts at reform that have not been as successful as they should have been, including in the mid-90s. I would contrast that with efforts at reform at the Department of Defense, where I've also served, that have been more successful in about the same time period. So I think the Defense Department has done a better job of reorganizing.
So this is an unprecedented moment in time, and I look forward to working through this to reform it and find out what works well and what doesn't work well, and get rid of those things that don't, and let's make those things that are working well more efficient so that we can get more bang for the buck, especially in these times of economic constraint. With that being said, what places do you think we need to redirect? And keep in mind, and this builds on what Gregory Meeks brought up about the geopolitical knowledge. We've seen how it failed in Robert Gates' book, Duty, how we didn't take the geopolitical, the customs of the area, the tribal culture in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we didn't get the results we wanted, obviously. And how we can take that knowledge as we move into different areas, as there's these different conflicts starting to develop, and use that more to our advantage to create policies so that we get more favorable results in a timely manner. Where do you see we need to focus more on that we haven't?
Well, I think as a starting point, I'd want to see a more diverse State Department, that we have more diverse viewpoints contributing to the formulation of policy, whether it's veterans, women, minorities, language, culture, expertise, bringing all of that to bear, all of the strengths that our country has, bringing those strengths to bear on these diplomatic challenges, combined with working with our intelligence agencies and our experts at the State Department to address all of those issues that you have raised, whether we're dealing with a conflict in Syria, in South Asia, in Mindanao in the Philippines.
Right.
Very different areas.
It really is. And I mean, we're seeing the escalation in radical groups showing up. You had brought up, and I want to, just for the record, reiterate this, the amount of people, you said you're 50% staffed or understaffed, I guess, but yet the amount of people that have been nominated that haven't been confirmed by the Senate, that's where the holdup is, the way I understand it, correct?
Well, I want to be fair to the Senate. A number of those, we've got 30 nominees pending.
That's all right.
They
this
haven't
is the
been,
House.
They haven't been pending for 6 months. Some of them have only been, have been pending for only a relatively short period of time. But they've all come out of the pipeline, and they're now sitting before the Foreign Relations Committee.
Okay. And then Burma had come up. And you talked about the $32 million to start to address the Rohingya situation in Burma. I would hope as we move forward, as you're redirecting this, that we've known about this escalating over probably the last 5 years, and we've seen it build up. So instead of investing the $32 million now, which we have to, but I would hope that we'd have the foresight as we see this arising and starting to become inflamed, that we do a better job on the front end so that maybe we can de-escalate this. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is not a problem that just arose over the summer,
right?
This month.
And that's so true on so many of the conflicts we have around the world. That that's where I hope that with your leadership and Secretary Tillerson's, that we can look at that and say, these are hot spots. We need to get in here now so that we don't have 400,000 refugees in the last couple months and over 1 million displaced. That will be the next hot spot that we need to do now. What are your thoughts where we need to really focus?
Well, right now, even though we should have anticipated this, we're now stuck with the problem we have with the hundreds of thousands of refugees. So we've got to work with allies, partners, others, the UN. We can't, it's not a United States problem. 32 million from us is a drop in the bucket. We've got to get other countries and the UN involved as well.
And I would hope, I'm going to offer this through our committee, and the chairman, I think, would probably be okay with this. Use this committee as a tool to get the legislation or direction that you need to direct the policies that we need, okay? And I thank you for your time, and I yield back.
Thank you.
And I concur with the gentleman. We go to Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think as you outline the purposes of the redesign plan in terms of streamlining and maximizing efficiencies and avoiding duplication, I think we all agree with that. In fact, every agency of the federal government should be engaged in that work on an ongoing basis. But I think one of the things that sort of troubles me a little bit about this process is that the Secretary of State sent out a memorandum and then an email indicating that this redesign would generate, and I quote, a minimum deliverable of 10%, $5 billion in efficiencies relative to current spending over the next 5 years, with an aspirational general interest target of up to 20%, $10 billion. So my first question is, where do those figures come from?
Right.
The $10 billion, what data did you rely on to come up with them? And isn't it sort of a perversion of the process that you have, unless it's just about cost cutting, that you have as really the only stated goal, cost cutting in these amounts before the process has even begun?
Sure. Well, very, very good questions, Congressman. First, on the budget numbers, to give you an example, the amount of money we spend now for legacy IT systems just to keep them running is staggering. So we're going to have to, we spend for outdated systems to keep them patched and running huge amounts of money.
No,
Right, so-
I don't want to interrupt, but I do have limited time. But I guess my question is, where did those amounts come from at the beginning of the process? You're talking about IT as one of the strategies, but who came up with the $10 billion and $5 billion cuts? They were just pulled out of the air?
Those aren't cuts. Those are efficiencies that we expect from the process that will result. We're not saying up front, we're going to cut $5 billion. What the Secretary said is, when we implement these new processes, procedures, and efficiencies, we expect $5 billion in savings. If we don't get that, we don't get that. We'll be disappointed. We will have not accomplished what we hope to achieve, but we're not setting out with a $5 billion cut.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, members of this administration have given mixed messages when it comes to the role of democracy and human rights in our foreign policy. My colleague Brendan Boyle and I sent a letter to Secretary Tillerson on August 11th, raising our concerns about reports that democracy promotion was possibly going to be taken out of the State Department's mission statement. We received a reply from the State Department saying that the department agrees that democracy promotion has been and should be a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. However, this response doesn't actually answer the question of whether democracy promotion will remain in the State Department's mission statement. So my first question is, will it remain in the mission statement?
Yes.
My second question is, when the expression of support for democracy and human rights matters, but you also have to view it in the context in which we're currently operating. The President of the United States, who continues to express admiration for the thug Vladimir Putin, a president who called to congratulate President Erdogan when a referendum passed that undermined basic rule of law, a president who invited President Duarte from the Philippines to come to the White House, and Secretary Tillerson, who says Americans should not impose their values on others. So in that context, is somebody in the State Department speaking to the president about the consequences of that kind of mixed message, that you have a State Department where it's recognizing democracy and human rights as an important value that we're going to promote around the world, and the president of the country is doing things to undermine that important message? I mean, it's important to recognize it's not just promotion of democracy and human rights for the sake of it. It's because it's also important to the stability of the world, to the ability of our American businesses to invest, and all the kind of other consequences of that democracy brings.
For all the reasons you state, Congressman, it's exceptionally important to us that we be committed to promoting democracy. It's necessary for our own national security, that other countries are secure and stable, and that, as you point out, for example, that our businesses have stable, open markets with democratic governments in which to do business.
But how do we manage that objective with the declarations of the President of the United States, which directly undermine that message?
Well, the President's got to deal with, as I discussed earlier, we've got to deal with governments that are undemocratic, whether they are...
You deal with them and praising them are two different things.
Well, I will defer to the President on how he deals with particular world leaders, but our commitment to democracy at the State Department on behalf of the Secretary is unwavering.
If I can just get in one last question. As you know, U.S. foreign assistance programs are really critical to advancing the stability and growing economies of developing countries, which are vital to U.S. national security interests, and it can help us avoid costlier conflicts. As former Defense Secretary Robert Gates noted, development contributes to stability, contributes to better governance, and if you're able to do those things, you're able to do them in a focused and sustainable way, then it may be unnecessary for us to send soldiers. Do you share the view of Secretary Gates and many of our military leaders that robust investments in civilian foreign assistance and diplomacy budgets are necessary for effective U.S. leadership in the world? And if you do, how do you square that with the proposal to cut 32% of the State Department budget by President Trump?
The answer to your first question is emphatically yes. The answer to your second question is it's on us to manage the State Department in a more efficient and effective way and spend the money that the President's asked for, but Congress appropriates, and spend the budget we've got in an effective and efficient way, and promote that, implement that diplomacy to promote our national security and our economy.
But you don't think you can do that with a 32% cut in your budget, do you, Mr. Secretary?
I'm sorry?
You don't think you can do that successfully with a 32% cut in your budget, do you?
I believe we can.
Okay.
I believe we can.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the courtesy. I yield back.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Ron DeSantis of Florida.
Good morning or afternoon. In May, when the President signed the waiver under the Jerusalem Embassy Act forestalling moving our embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, he said we will, in fact, move it. It's just a matter of time. So will we move it, and when are we going to move it?
Two questions. The first, yes, the President is committed to moving it. The decision on when to move it is a strategic and tactical decision that the President himself, in consultation with the Secretary, will have to make, but the President has been quite clear in his commitment on that.
So the State Department's view is that's the President's policy. Obviously, he's got to pull the trigger, but your agency is going to facilitate that move when it happens, correct?
We work for the President.
Okay. Number two, we're talking about, the Palestinian Authority. They will take money, some of it comes from the United States, and they'll fund families of terrorists who murder Jews. They'll name stadiums after terrorists, and we have a bill in the Congress, the Taylor Force Act, that's trying to address at least some of that. Does the administration support the Taylor Force Act?
I'm aware of the bill. I don't know whether we have issued an administration policy on that bill, but I will say that we at the State Department are certainly opposed to all of those things that you've just said that the Palestinian Authority does.
Great. For the Iran deal, this idea of technical compliance, is it true that Iran has exceeded on numerous occasions the amount of heavy water stocks and they're permitted under the JCPOA?
I'm venturing into an area that I'm not don't have sufficient expertise, but I'll offer the following. My understanding is that there have been instances, such as you cite, where there may have been the Iranians may have gone over the line, but they came back down.
Well, and they have buried that. What about the operating more advanced nuclear centrifuges than were allowed under the JCPOA? That has happened as well.
Yeah, I'm going to have to defer to the experts on that. But
so here's the issue, I think, that you guys, in terms of the advice that the State Department's given to the President, does not like this deal. He campaigned saying it was bad. His UN speech was very clear that this was not a good deal. We see what's happening in North Korea right now. Very difficult situation. 5-10 years into the future, if this deal continues as is, it's going to be the same thing, maybe even more intractable at that point. And so to simply recertify it as being within our national security interests, I think would be a mistake. The Muslim Brotherhood, there's a lot of nefarious influence that they have. The President has said that, other members of the administration, but yet they have not been designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the State Department. Why not? And is there a possibility that state will designate them as such?
I understand that issue has been under review, and not just now, but in the past. I don't have a...
Is it currently still under review?
I will have to get back to you on that, Congressman, but...
I know it was earlier. We haven't heard as much about it, and so if a decision's been made that that you guys don't want to identify them, then we would like to know that. So if you can get back to me, I'd appreciate it.
I will get back to you on that.
Cuba, we see these attacks on your personnel. You acknowledge, Cuba is a totalitarian country. There's not much that goes on that island that the government doesn't know about. So isn't it reasonable to say either Cuba was directly responsible for this, or they at least knew and know who is responsible for it?
That's certainly a reasonable suspicion. I don't know that, but it's a reasonable suspicion. I say that on the basis of the fact that my family, my wife's a Cuban American. Her uncle was a political prisoner for 27 years. Then
I can only imagine what she would infer about the regime.
She told me last night they know. Okay. As a United States government official, I don't know that.
Well, the question is, though, what are we going to do? Obviously, we just can't let this happen and not do anything.
We have two issues. We have, first and foremost, the health and safety of our employees and their families who are down there, to make sure that they are protected and cared for. And then second, we have our policy with respect to the government of Cuba. Our expectations for them to comply with the Geneva Convention, and if they're not, to do something about it.
I hope you guys do. I think we need a response to this. Obviously, get the facts and don't do anything rash, but this is unacceptable. My final question is, as we look at the North Korea situation, how does the State Department view Kim Jong-un in terms of his rationality? Does he appreciate a response if he were to do some of the things they're talking about? I mean, he's a young, plump, immature kid, and we don't have as much information, it seems, on him, and because of the nature of the regime. So how does the State Department view Kim Jong-un?
I defer to the intelligence agencies on their assessment of the leader of North Korea. We're approaching this as we're dealing with a government and assuming that they're rational and that the pressure campaign that the Secretary of State has led, the significant pressure campaign, will influence them through the pressure that's being brought to bear by not just by the United States, but by China, Russia, and other members of the UN who are applying the UN Security Council resolutions. We're going to do all we can to give diplomacy a chance to resolve this problem.
Okay, we've got a meeting with the South Korean Foreign Minister at 12:30. So we're going to get to everyone here, but we'll keep it to 5 minutes. We go to Dr. Ami Bera.
Great. Thank you, Secretary Sullivan. And I appreciate your candor, actually. And, thinking about where we are right now and thinking about some of the comments of some of my colleagues, one of the responses in response to Mr. Connolly from Virginia, I think I heard you correctly that in your own understanding, morale right now within the department is not high. Is that correct?
Correct.
So that's obviously a challenge. In the results of your own survey, which you've referenced a number of times, those findings also suggested that many of the employees don't feel the support of the President and the Secretary. And am I interpreting those findings correctly?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
So in response to your own survey and published reports, many of the employees of the State Department themselves don't feel the support of the President or the Secretary.
I don't know that that was specifically addressed in the survey. I'd say that when I say that morale is not high, I think there's uncertainty, and that causes uncertainty leaves people unsettled, and we need to address that.
But we could surmise if you work for a department and you're told that we're going to cut your budget 30%, that you don't feel support, that you feel that. So, and I'm not discounting, there were also, you've referenced, outdated IT, redundancies, duplicative processes. So, we're all for trying to improve efficiency. But, again, widely reported surveys, Wall Street Journal, others, suggest that many of the employees of the department don't feel that support from the White House. Mr. Kinzinger asked a question, and again, I want to make sure I heard this correctly. Less than 50% of the assistant undersecretary positions are currently filled?
By confirmed presidential appointees, yes.
Okay. Mr. Rohrbacher asked a question and suggested that nearly 50 countries currently don't have an appointed or confirmed ambassador.
I'm not certain about that statistic. I'd have to get back to you on that. But if they don't have a confirmed ambassador, they have a charge who is performs the duties and functions.
But again, there is an urgency to get those ambassador positions
I'd be the
filled.
first to acknowledge that we need to fill these positions as quickly as possible.
Do we currently have a South Korean ambassador?
We do not.
Do we have one that we're going to put forth for nomination?
We have an individual who is in the vetting process. But the nomination hasn't been announced yet.
Do we have an ambassador to Jordan?
I don't know where that person stands in the process.
My understanding is currently we don't have.
Well, we don't have an ambassador now, but I thought the question was.
Now this is one of our closest allies, a country that is stressed by 1.5 to 2 million refugees, and they're struggling, and we have to do everything we can to support Jordan. Do we have an ambassador to Qatar?
No, we have a charge.
Do we have an ambassador to Saudi Arabia?
For all these reasons you suggest, Congressman, we need to have those positions filled.
Absolutely, right? I mean, there's a lot going on in the Middle East right now. Right. We need those folks on the ground representing us.
I do want to say, if I may, though, that the career people who are, and some of these positions will be filled by career people, but the State Department, through its Foreign Service officers who are standing up and doing their jobs, are filling in either as acting or as chargés. So our work is getting done. It would be better done if we had those positions.
Absolutely, and I don't want to disparage, our State Department employees all around the world. I think they're doing a phenomenal job under trying circumstances. They're stepping up. They're representing the values of the United States, and they are true patriots. But we've got to get these positions filled. Would you say the holdup currently is within the State Department or at the White House?
Both.
So how
in the Senate.
What can we do as members of the Foreign Affairs Committee to help speed up this process? Because I think many of us travel, visit with folks. We're also sensing that we need these positions filled. What can we do to push the urgency of now?
Well, for this committee, I'm not sure what I would recommend other than your support for our nominees that we have going forward. We can get the nominees through the pipeline up to the Foreign Relations Committee, but to the extent that there could be support for those nominees and to get them confirmed as quickly as possible, that would be much.
Let's get these positions filled.
Right.
Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, Mr. Mike McCall of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Sullivan, Secretary, congratulations on your confirmation.
Thank you.
And welcome to your first hearing. I wanted to touch on cyber security. I deal a lot with that on Homeland Security issues, and I think the State Department is going to be more and more involved in this area. As I see the espionage coming out of foreign adversary nation states, cyber warfare, and I think right now there are no rules of the road. There are really no treaties or other things agreed to by nation states. Would NATO apply in the event of a cyber attack? And so there are a lot of issues that or questions raised about cyber that I think the State Department, in my view, as cyber becomes a bigger and bigger issue, the State Department is going to have quite a role in this arena. So I want to ask you about what you envision the future at State to be on that issue. I know there's an Office of Cyber Coordination for Cyber Issues that's being sort of downplayed with another office. I want to thank Chairman Royce and Engel, ranking member, for introducing the Cyber Diplomacy Act of 2017, which would essentially codify into law an Office of Cyber Issues headed by an ambassador reporting directly to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. I'm not sure I want to put you quite on the spot with that bill itself, but can you give me your thoughts on the direction moving forward?
And I've spoken to the Secretary about this, and we've had a number of conversations about the need to elevate this issue within the State Department, cyber broadly defined, not only our cyber defense, but our cyber diplomacy and our interaction with the Department of Defense on cyber issues. And my expectation is that part of our redesign, we will elevate to a Senate-confirmed level the role, and we'll have to figure out what the title is and where it figures in the bureaucracy, but our commitment is to elevate and provide the appropriate resources for leadership on this essential issue.
I think that's excellent, because this is no longer just a FBI, Homeland, NSA issue. It's really a State Department issue, and so I'm very pleased to hear that. Secondly, as I look at hotspots, and particularly in Africa, but these fragile states, out of destabilization rises insurgencies and terrorists, safe havens and vacuums. Can you tell me what the State Department will be doing with USAID to help with foreign assistance programs to help stabilize this destabilization? It seems to me would be a very good use of our money rather than have to deal with the terrorism insurgencies after the fact.
Well, I'll give you a current example about our planning for a post-ISIS Syria. As we defeat ISIS in Raqqa, as we move further east in Syria, the State Department, USAID, the U.S. government, our allies and partners need to fill in, provide the basic services, water, food, hygiene, to get refugees back into their homes, to try to rehabilitate these communities. This isn't nation building. This is just basic human necessities to try to address the calamity that's been visited on these cities and these regions by an occupation by ISIS. And that's a role, that's where the State Department, USAID, and our allies and partners need to step up. The Defense Department and our allies and partners are defeating ISIS. We've got to be prepared to step in after that battle is won and take the ball from there.
That's very, very good to hear that. I think that's an excellent approach. And last, I'll just make a quick statement because my time's running out. The Global Development Lab, I've been a strong supporter of that in the past, and I ask that you take a look at that in terms of State Department support.
Be happy to. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, sir.
Brad Snyder of Illinois.
Thank you, and Deputy Secretary, thank you for your long service to our nation and indulging us here today in this hearing, and your candor in your answers. We're here talking about this restructuring, and restructuring, I think everyone would agree, anytime we can find efficiencies, we should pursue those and pursue those aggressively. But a restructuring, whether it's in business or in this case in the State Department, should follow a strategic structure, and that strategy should follow from our mission and vision. What would you, broadly stated, what would you define as the mission of the State Department right now?
The mission of the State Department is to, in promotion of American democratic values, to implement U.S. foreign policy through active diplomacy.
And within that, the Secretary's vision or your vision of how we go about doing that in the context of the world we face in 2017 and looking forward?
Wow, that's a big question. We've got several layers of challenges. We have countries, regions where there are imminent national security threats to the United States, whether it's ISIS in Syria, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, the Haqqani network in South Asia, which are obvious priorities to protect the United States, to protect our national security. But beyond that, throughout the globe, there are areas where, as has been raised elsewhere in this hearing, where we want to be active to make sure that we're on the lookout for that next Iraq and Syria, for that next Mindanao in the Philippines, so that we are being proactive. We have people on the ground who are able to spot issues, spot problems before they become national security threats to the United States. That's one of our key jobs at the State Department.
And looking at that as a goal, promoting U.S. interests around the world has to be a goal. I think it was my colleague from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger, who pointed out that we didn't have those feet on the ground, those eyes in the community in Afghanistan, and paid some dire consequences because of that. And yet, as we talk about this reorganization, it seems that the emphasis is on cost-cutting. Emphasis is on the efficiencies. How does the reorganization specifically fit within the goals underlying the strategy that you just laid out?
So a lot of, when we talk about efficiencies and effectiveness, part of it is the budget and the cost savings, but part of it is also empowering our men and women in the Foreign Service and the Civil Service for redundant bureaucratic processes or bureaucratic processes that don't serve our people well. I've heard complaints since the day I arrived on the bureaucracy that manages how our women and men and their families transfer from post to post, how they process, how their bills are processed, how they do it, making their lives easier as they should be is in how they serve in their service to our country is one of the things we talk when we talk about effectiveness and cost savings and eliminating redundancies.
Absolutely, and what you describe is having a diplomatic corps, development officers around the world who feel empowered. There was a business book, and clearly from this reorganization plan, there's many lessons taken from business here. But one of my favorite examples of how to have a good workforce is you give them, you empower them, you give them autonomy, you allow them to master their skills, and you let them operate with a clear purpose. I'm not sure I see this from here, so that's one of my concerns, and we've touched on the morale issue. I think if we can present a narrative to the people at the State Department and the American people of what are we trying to achieve and how this better achieves it, that'd be great. What I'm seeing is this is much more of an emphasis on cost reductions and slashing than it is on pursuing and protecting and promoting our interests around the world. Let me take, in the limited time I have, take you to some other questions. One of the concerns many of us have are the President's tweets, specifically as it relates to foreign affairs, I think specifically as it relates of recent moments to North Korea. How is the State Department managing that? What can we do to make sure that we don't get ourselves into a unintended situation with North Korea?
Well, both Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis have made it clear that diplomacy is our prime objective in addressing the North Korean problem and denuclearizing the North Korean peninsula. Secretary's made clear that we're not looking for regime change in North Korea. We're not looking to cross the 38th parallel. Diplomacy is our principal means of addressing this problem. General McMaster and Secretary Mattis, for that matter, have also said that this is a regime that has weapons that can threaten the United States, so we need to be prepared with a military response, but that's not our first resort. Our first and principal objective is to use American diplomacy, American pressure through our allies, our partners in countries like China and Russia to bring this situation to a rational conclusion and denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, which is everyone's goal and the purpose of those UN Security Council resolutions.
Thank you. I agree with you. Diplomacy has to be the front of that to make sure we have a good solution to this crisis. And I yield back.
Well, we thank Mr. Schneider for going on our delegation to South Korea last month. We go to Mr. Tom Garrett of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask if diplomacy is as effective a mechanism to affect change where other options are publicly and clearly not on the table. And by other options, I mean kinetic options.
With respect to North Korea?
Sure. I guess the suggestion that I would submit for your comment quickly is that diplomatic efforts have a greater likelihood of success if there are some teeth to the possibility that there might be efforts that are more kinetic in nature.
Correct. And General McMaster and Secretary Mattis have made that clear.
Right. And I want to make sure that that's clear to anyone who's watching at home or maybe perhaps in Pyongyang or anywhere else in the world, that we want a peaceful and diplomatic solution, but that while the lives of Americans and our allies are threatened, all options are on the table. And that needs to be clear. Sorry for the soliloquy. I've done a little bit of research on you, and I find that you, like myself, made the mistake of pursuing a legal education. The only thing that you might do that would be looked upon in less esteem than being a lawyer is perhaps being a member of this body. I'm kidding, maybe. But I wonder if you're familiar with the UN Security Council Resolution 1929 from 2010 with regards to Iranian ballistic missile and nuclear activity.
I am.
And so then you're undoubtedly aware that the wording of that resolution was that Iran shall not undertake, and I stress shall not because that has meaning to lawyers and diplomats, et cetera, the testing of ballistic missiles that might be married to a nuclear program. That's correct?
It is phrased in the imperative, they shall not.
And so, too, in 2015, the Security Council Resolution 2231 with regards to Iran, formed after the JCPOA, which I've repeatedly referred to, not to be cute, but based on wholehearted opinion, as the JCPOS, which says Iran is called upon not to undertake these activities. You familiar with that wording?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, so in 2010 the wording was Iran shall not. In 2015 the wording was Iran is called upon not to. And you said earlier that the UN had said that Iran was in technical compliance with the JCPOA, but it violated the spirit of the JCPOA. When the wording hammered out is Iran is called upon not to, as opposed to is shall not, does that make your job more difficult as it relates to creating a circumstance where Iran doesn't enhance its nuclear capability and the ability to deliver such weapons?
It certainly undercuts the argument that Iran is proscribed from its the ballistic missile activity that's engaged in.
So, I mean, I wonder, and this is rhetorical, what sort of attorneys and diplomats hammered out language that was far more permissive than the precedent language, and what the intent was, or if it was complete incompetence. That was rhetorical. I want to take a moment to draw attention, Mr. Chairman, if you'll grant me the leave, to the gentlemen and ladies in this room in yellow coats and those not wearing yellow coats, which are emblazoned with Free Iran, and the perpetual presence of these individuals in this committee to stand for a free Iranian nation where individuals are empowered to make decisions for themselves without fear of the retribution of a regime through the IRGC and the Quds force thereof that is willing to take the lives of their very brothers and sisters. And I want to applaud them and ask them to continue in these efforts that one day, perhaps, we'll see the fruit of your diligence and your persistence. So I apologize for the aside, but I think it's important to recognize that you all are always here, that it matters, and that it matters to Chairman Royce, to Ranking Member Engel, and the members of this committee. And I get frustrated as a member of this body that sometimes I feel like things don't move quickly enough, but we will achieve an outcome that is just and fair for good people across the planet, and that flies in the face of the totalitarian and radical objectives of those who seek to oppress human beings. And so thank you. Finally, I would submit that I believe that the application of appropriately spent funds on foreign aid might, if properly done, save money on things like bullets and bombs and rockets. I would ask if you would concur that foreign aid has a role in peace and stability throughout the world.
I would join Secretary Mattis in agreeing with that wholeheartedly.
And so I appreciate that, because I think some of the rhetoric and questioning heretofore has indicated that money is the sole arbiter of our commitment to diplomacy and peaceful outcomes. And I would ask you, is the intent of the reorganization simply to perform our job more efficiently and as better stewards of tax dollars, and not to gut our foreign aid efforts, which would, I think, meet with bipartisan resistance from this committee and others?
That is exactly the purpose, Congressman. It is not to gut our foreign aid.
I thank you for your efforts and applaud you and look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Lois Frankel of Florida.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. And I thank you for your service, and I have great admiration for those who serve in the State Department, and I think it's a very important function of our government. And just as my colleagues have done, I think, a good job in covering a lot of issues, and I just want to say that I'll start by saying I think reorganization is part of the bureaucracy. Every bureaucracy reorganizes. That's part of bureaucracy, and it doesn't make sense to me that before you would reorganize or go through this process, there would be a suggestion of a 1/3 cut in the budget. But I'll put that aside for now, because I want to talk about the women of the world, all right? And here's what I'm very concerned about. And I won't be accusatory. I'm going to try to be diplomatic. That's rare. I'm going to try to be diplomatic. But listen, I believe that the actions that this administration has taken is systematically going to add great suffering to women and families around the globe. And I just want to mention a couple of them. I think right off the bat, of course, is the elimination for funding for global family planning and reproductive health, eliminating funding for international organizations and programs which support voluntary contributions to several programs in the UN system, prohibiting contributions to the UNFPA, which works not only with women's health, but obviously child marriage, and expanding the global gag rule. The old one wasn't good enough. I could go on and on. The proposed $1 billion decrease in the global health programs, which will disproportionately harm women and girls. Now, I do have a question out of this. I know you're waiting for that. There is an Office of Global Women's Issues, and there is a proposal to downgrade it. I think it's a downgrade, but you'll have to tell me if it is, which is to downgrade the Office of Global Women's Issues from the Secretary's Office to one that it instead reports to the Undersecretary for Civilian Democracy and Human Rights. So can you explain the difference that will be? Is there plans to name an ambassador at large to lead the office? Those are my first two questions. And why don't you answer those first?
Sure. Yes, that, in fact, I've interviewed candidates for that position. It will be filled promptly, and it is the proposal that was sent up to this committee and to Congress on moving the office. The office is going to remain as is with the same structure and budget. It's moving it from the Office of the Secretary to a bureau under the Undersecretary, as you mentioned. We believe that that's actually strengthens the office. What's happened with all of the special envoys, there are almost 70 of them, they all report to the Secretary. For the Secretary to have 70 individuals or 70 offices reporting to him, he doesn't have the time to dedicate to each and every one of them. All of them important. With this office, which is important not just to the Secretary but to the President, if it's got the support of the State Department bureaucracy, the bureau in which it will be located, and I think the most important feature of this office is the person we nominate. The office is going to be as good as the person we nominate, and that's really the key issue.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. But I want to say this as emphatically as I can. There is no reorganization in the State Department that is a substitute for enabling women around this world to be in control of their own bodies and to have reproductive health. So that is the message I want to say. And I think this administration is on the wrong path. It's going to cause a lot of harm, not only to the health of women and their families, but to the economic security of their countries. Because when women cannot be in control of their own bodies, they don't work and they don't produce for the economy. And with that,
Will the gentlelady yield for one question? I have a question I have to ask just on behalf of the committee. We need to hear about the redesign timeline. When will you be coming back to the committee with the legislative reform proposals?
Well, we've started that process, Mr. Chairman, with the proposals on special envoys. My expectation is that as the redesign goes forward, we will be coming, as they're ready, with proposals to this committee. My hope and expectation is that all of the major reforms that we're going to propose will be done by the end of this calendar year.
By the end of the calendar year. Thank you. And Mr. Tom Garrett will be presiding as chairman, and Mr. Espiat as ranking member from here on out. Thank you.
Thank you. We now recognize Representative Norma Torres of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary, congratulations. You are now 4 months and 2 days into your position. Congratulations. Modernization is a good thing for any government, agency, bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it. And I fully support giving the State Department the technology it needs to keep our nation abroad safe. At a time when we are facing serious threats from North Korea, Russia, and elsewhere, I firmly believe that we need a State Department that is fully equipped to keep us safe. Unfortunately, this administration has followed a path, huge budget cuts, leaving senior positions unfilled, that has weakened the State Department and put our national security at risk. So I am looking forward, as my colleagues, to seeing that redesign timeline and how specifically and knowledgeably these cuts are going to be implemented. One of the most significant threats to our national security is the prevalence of corruption across the globe. Threats to our homeland, including terrorism and drug trafficking, often arise in countries where corruption thrives. Corrupt actors also pose a real danger to our political and economic system when they seek to launder their funds in U.S. banks, lobby our government to advance their own interests, and even seek to interfere in our elections. This past week, I traveled to Guatemala as part of the House Democracy Partnership delegation. Guatemala is currently in the middle of a crisis that is a result of political elites trying to protect themselves from a U.S.-supported anti-corruption drive. I'm very worried that if the progress that we have made in Guatemala is turned back, it could have very significant impact once again at our border. How will the reorganization process help state become more effective in combating corruption, and what steps are you taking to ensure that state coordinates more effectively with other agencies, including the Department of Justice, to ensure that we are protected from the influence of foreign corruption?
Well, you're absolutely right, Congresswoman. Corruption is a serious problem. It's a serious problem, a national security problem for us in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Corruption in Afghanistan is an enormous problem. The Afghan government acknowledges it. The issue you raised in Guatemala, that's a very serious problem. The ray of hope I see in Guatemala is the judicial decision that reversed the president's decision on removing the head of that commission. There is some hope that the rule of law will triumph there.
Well, I cannot hang my hat, if I wore one, on hope, sir. So I specifically want to know what steps we are taking to ensure that the State Department is more effectively coordinating with other agencies to ensure that we know what is happening and that we take steps to prevent these governments from influencing our government.
Well, we are working closely with the Justice Department and with other government agencies in Guatemala in particular to address this problem. We've made that our position clear that the United States does not support the actions that the president took, and there will be consequences.
I'm going to be a little bit critical of our folks down there because I think that they were not fully informed or were being very evasive with our members at disclosing everything that has been happening in the region. We are at in a place where there is no going back. Either we move forward. There were 200,000 people demonstrating in the streets of Guatemala when we landed. 200,000 people that could be seen from the air. If we don't continue to advance and support the people there and at ensuring that this government in Guatemala, the current government, understands that we will not stand for their elitist corruption behavior, we're going to be in serious trouble, sir, when we're going to see more children come to the U.S., and I have spent the last 3 years working to ensure that that doesn't happen, that they can see a future for themselves. I understand that you've only been at this position for 4 months, but the first hour on your job, I expect everybody to know what is going on and be prepared for the job. Recent years, USAID has made significant progress in monitoring and evaluating its programming. As you work to more closely align our development efforts with our foreign policy goals, how will you ensure that the gains of USAID has made in this area are not diluted back? And maybe you can write back or maybe answer some of the letters that I have written in response to what is happening in the region. My time is up, so I'm going to yield back.
Thank you, ma'am. And I would now recognize Representative Adriano Ospilot of New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman Garrett. Deputy Secretary, thank you so much for your patience, long time in answering our questions. We're really thankful for your patience. I want to find out what is given the current storms that have hit the Caribbean, what is the extent that USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistant, what are they doing and what is currently in place in these small nations that have been Barbuda, Dominica, the Dominican Republic, that have been hard hit by hurricane, both Irma and Maria in some cases?
Yes, the DART teams at USAID are very important tools for the U.S. government, both with respect to the hurricanes that have hit the Caribbean and the earthquakes in Mexico.
That's correct.
AID is really stretched to the limit at this point in its capacity in dealing with all of these horrible natural disasters that have occurred simultaneously. So it's a big challenge for us. And of course, we've got in our own Puerto Rico enormous problems that we've got to, as a U.S. government, address. So AID is working on this with all of its available resources, but it's a big challenge.
And in terms of funding, have you allocated, how much money has been allocated to response to these natural disasters so far?
I will have to get you the exact figure, and I will undertake to do that right after this hearing, sir.
Now, you mentioned Puerto Rico, and obviously probably the island that has been hard hit the most is Puerto Rico. It's been termed like a Caribbean Katrina. And I wanted to see, and FEMA has been also, just as you have, asking for help. They're really depleted. Their resources have been depleted. Is there any way that you can team up with FEMA to help Puerto Rico and the U.S. territories?
Yes, we have actually sent teams down over the weekend, both to assist the U.S. government effort and to assist our State Department colleagues who work in Puerto Rico. So for Puerto Rico, though, unlike foreign countries, these are U.S. citizens who are in trouble. This is a U.S. government problem, not just a State Department problem. So we're doing all we can to support our colleagues in FEMA, DHS, is coordinated by the White House. But it's an enormous challenge, Congressman, as you know as well as anyone.
Now, having said that, having heard that from you, I know that we often assist U.S. citizens for being evacuated from Caribbean countries, but there are right now currently 20,000 Puerto Ricans that are waiting for on a waiting list to be evacuated or to leave the Commonwealth. Is there anything that could be done to help them? They're U.S. citizens, although they are in a U.S. Territory.
Yes.
They are waiting to come either to the United States or other places in the world where they may have families or they may seek the help that they need right now.
Or people who have medical emergencies, for example, who need to get off the island. There have been problems, as I understand it, with the airport and airports, and I'm not as familiar because it's U.S. domestic territory. But we're doing all we can at the State Department to support our colleagues at DHS as coordinated by the White House in trying to address these problems.
Will you be able to help them to evacuate them from the island to wherever they...
We'll do all we can to assist.
Okay, thank you. And finally, with regards to the medical needs in Puerto Rico, do you have Spanish-speaking personnel, and is there assistance from the Pan American Health Organization to Puerto Rico going there? I mean, the second phase usually of these disasters is health issues, Zika, other kinds of diseases that may spurt up because of stagnated water and the flooding. Do you have any plans for medical assistance with the help of DHS?
Just as we did with the original hurricane that hit Houston, State Department people went down, were mobilized as part of the response by DHS and FEMA. My expectation is that we will do the same in Puerto Rico as soon as we're able to get people on the island and to not expose them to danger, but to do all we can to help.
My time is up. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from New York for adhering to the time limits, and I thank the Deputy Secretary for his time and the Department for engaging with this committee in the process. I would ask that upon your return, you provide information focusing on how we are not slashing foreign aid, but instead trying to be more efficient and more effective and better stewards. I think that that's something that you've heard a repeated call for. With that, we stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.